Kenneth McLean, Dendul, Adriana Harvey, 1535, 1536, 1538, 1539, accepting Sean Jones, Carl Fickenshire, 1540, accepting 1975, 2031, 2146, 2148, 2233, 2234, 2235, 2004, 1537, except P. Pierre Louis, 1978, 2147. That the Senate proceed to their en bloc consideration and vote without intervening. If confirmed, the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate, and the President be immediately notified of the Senate's actions, and the Senate resume legislative session.
Is there objection?
Legislative session.
Is there objection? Question occurs on the nominations in block. Objection. Question occurs on the nominations in block. All in favor say aye. Any opposed, nay?
Aye.
The ayes appears to have it. The ayes do have it. The nominations are confirmed en bloc.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the appointments at the desk appear separately in the record as if made.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the junior senator from Virginia, the senior senator from Ohio, and the senior senator from Maryland be authorized to sign duly enrolled bills or joint resolutions from December 20th, 2024 through January 3rd, 2025.
Without objection.
President, I ask unanimous consent that notwithstanding the upcoming adjournment of the Senate, the President of the Senate, the President pro tem, and the majority and minority leaders be authorized to make commissions, committees, boards, conferences, or interparliamentary conferences authorized by law by concurrent action of the two houses or by order of the Senate.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of Calendar 6488. I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of Calendar 648 HR 4984.
The clerk will report.
Calendar number 648, HR 498, Secretary of the Interior to transfer administrative jurisdiction over the Robert F. Kennedy Memorial Stadium campus to the District of Columbia and so forth and for other purposes.
Is there objection proceeding to the measure? Without objection, the Senate will proceed to the measure.
I ask unanimous consent the bill be considered read a third time.
Without objection.
For further debate on the bill.
Is there further debate? If not, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, no. The ayes appears to have it. The ayes do have it.
I ask unanimous.
The bill is passed.
And unanimous consent the motions to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of Calendar S5098.
The clerk will report.
Calendar number 685, S5098, a bill to require certain agencies to develop plans for internal control and so.
Is there objection proceeding to the measure? Without objection, the Senate will proceed.
I ask unanimous consent that the committee reported substitute amendment be agreed to. The bill read a third time and passed. The motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of HR 5887.
Clerk will report.
Calendar number 686, HR 5887, an act to amend Chapter 3 of Title 5 United States Code and so forth.
Is there objection proceeding to the measure? Without objection, the Senate will proceed.
I ask unanimous consent the bill be considered read a third time and passed. The motion to reconsider be considered made and tabled.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I ask the chair lay before the Senate the message to accompany S2181.
The Senate, the following message from the House.
Resolved that the bill from the Senate S2181 entitled An Act to Amend Title 38 United States Code and so forth and for other purposes do pass with an amendment and a title amendment.
I move to concur in the House amendment, and I ask unanimous consent the motion be agreed to.
Is there objection? Without objection.
I move to concur in the House and ask unanimous consent the motion be agreed to.
Is there objection? Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent that the motions to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there objection?
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation be discharged from further consideration of S 3658 and the Senate proceed to its immediate.
The clerk will report.
S 3658, a bill to promote space situational awareness and so forth and for other purposes.
Is there objection? Without objection, the committee is discharged and the Senate will proceed to the measure.
I ask unanimous consent that the Cornyn substitute amendment at the desk be considered and agreed to. The bill is read a third time and passed, and the motions to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration 5649, which is at the desk.
The clerk will report.
S 5649, a bill to amend the Marine Debris Act and so forth and for other purposes.
Is there objection? Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent that the bill be considered read a third time and passed, and that the motion to reconsider be considered made, laid upon the table.
Objection.
I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of H.R. 670, which was received from the House.
The clerk will report.
H.R. 670, an act to direct the Secretary of Health and Human Services to establish a website to promote awareness and so forth and for other purposes.
Is there objection to proceeding to the measure? Without objection.
I ask unanimous be considered read a third time and passed, and the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the Veterans Affairs Committee be discharged in the consideration of the following bills on block: H.R. 4955, H.R. 8667, H.R. 9124.
Is there an objection to proceeding the? Without objection, the committee is discharged and the Senate will proceed to the measures on block.
I ask unanimous consent that the bills be considered read a third time and passed, the motions to reconsider on the table, all on block.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent the Veterans Affairs Committee be discharged from further consideration of H.R. 4136, its immediate consideration.
The clerk will report.
H.R. 4136, an act to name the Department of Veterans Affairs Community-Based Outpatient Clinic in Plano, Texas, Sam Johnson Memorial VA Clinic.
Is there objection to proceeding to the measure? Without objection, the committee is discharged and the Senate will proceed to the measure.
I ask the bill be considered read a third time and passed, the motions to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that that the Finance Committee be discharged from further consideration of H.R. 9076 and the Senate proceed to its immediate consideration.
Report.
H.R. 9076, an act to reauthorize child welfare programs and so forth and for other purposes.
Is there objection to proceeding to the measure? Objection. The committee is discharged and the Senate will proceed to the measure.
I ask unanimous consent the bill be considered read a third time and passed, the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Without objection.
Unanimous consent the Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation be discharged from further consideration of H.R. 5103 and the Senate proceed to its immediate consideration.
The clerk will report.
103, an act to require the Director of the Office of Management and Budget to approve or deny spend plans within a certain amount of time and for other purposes.
Is there a measure? Without objection, the committee is discharged and the Senate will proceed to the measure.
I ask unanimous consent the bill be considered read a third time and passed, and that the motion to reconsider be considered.
Without objection.
And finally, Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that when the Senate completes its business today, it convene for a pro forma with no business conducted on the following dates and times: Monday, December 23rd, 9:30 a.m. Thursday, December 26th, 2:30 p.m. Monday, 30 p.m. Thursday, January 2nd at 12 noon. Friday, January 3rd at 11:45 a.m. Following the January 3rd pro forma, the Senate stand adjourned sine die, and next convene at 12 noon pursuant to the Constitution. Further, I ask that following the prayer and pledge and following the presentation of the certificates of election and the swearing in of elected members, required live quorum
Mr. Cruz, no.
On this vote, the yeas are 3, the nays are 9. On this vote, the yeas are 3, the nays are 93. The 60 vote threshold having not been achieved, the amendment is not agreed to.
Came close. My colleagues, Mr. President,
The majority
if we want
leader,
to finish at a reasonable
the Senate
hour,
will come to order.
Or
The
we
Senate
won't-
will come to order.
if we want to
The
finish
majority
as
leader.
quickly as possible, I'd urge members to stay in their seats and answer your name when it is called. That will speed things up. Thank you. And we're going to have 10-minute limit on votes, period.
President,
The senator from Kentucky.
I call up by amendment number 3352 and ask that it be reported by number.
The clerk will report.
The senator from Kentucky, Mr. Paul, proposes an amendment number 3352.
There are now up to 2 minutes for debate evenly divided. Is there any debate? Hearing none. The question is on the amendment. Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett,
No.
Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Braun, Mrs. Britt, Mr. Brown, Mr. Budd, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mr. Fetterman, Mrs. Fisher, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Mr. Rono, Mr. Hovind, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. Kim, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Mr. Mullen, Ms. Markowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Reed, Mr. Ricketts, Mr. Risch, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schiff, Mr. Schmidt, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Vance, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Welch, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Barrasso, Blackburn, Budd, Cassidy, Kramer, Crapo, Cruz, Daines, Ernst, Graham, Grassley, Haggerty, Hoeven, Johnson, Langford, Lee, Lummis, Marshall, Moran, Paul, Risch, Romney, Scott of South Carolina, Tuberville. Mr. Schmidt, aye. Mr. Thune, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Baldwin, Bennett, Blumenthal, Bozeman, Britt, Brown, Cantwell, Capito, Cardin, Carper, Casey, Collins, Coons, Cornyn, Cotton, Duckworth, Durbin, Betterman, Fisher, Gillibrand, Hassan, Hawley, Heinrich, Hickenlooper, Barono, Hyde-Smith, Kane, Kelly, Kennedy, Kim, King, Klobuchar, Lujan, Markey, McConnell, Merkley, Mullen, Murray, Ossoff, Padilla, Peters, Reed, Ricketts, Rosen, Rounds, Sanders, Schatz, Schumer, Shaheen, Sinema, Smith, Stabenow, Tester, Tillis, Van Hollen, Warner, Warren, Welch, Wicker, Wyden, Young. Ms. Murkowski, no. Mr. Braun, aye. Mr. Sullivan, no. Mr. Warnock, no. Mr. Murphy, no. Mr. Whitehouse, no. Mr. Scott of Florida, aye. Mr. Booker, no.
What do I do? Where is it?
On this vote, the yeas are 28, the nays are 67. The 60-vote threshold having not been achieved, the amendment is not agreed to.
These members, stay in your seats. Let's get this done quick.
Thanks. I got it.
Senator from Texas.
Mr. President, I call up my amendment number 3360 and ask that it be reported by number.
The clerk will report.
Senator from Texas, Mr. Cruz proposes an amendment number 3360.
There are now up to 2 minutes of debate equally divided.
Mr. President, everyone is here tonight voting on a provision to treat fairly our retired police officers, firefighters, and teachers. We should do that. The windfall elimination provision treated them unfairly. I've been fighting to correct this since 2017. We can correct this. We can treat our retired cops and firefighters and teachers fairly. However, the provision on the floor of the Senate tonight would add to the Social Security Trust Fund $200 billion in debt. Every member of this Senate, Republican and Democrat, has promised to our voters we will protect Social Security. The bill on the floor of the Senate tonight would accelerate the insolvency of Social Security by 6 months. My amendment fixes the inequity of the windfall elimination provision, but does so at a cost of only $25 billion instead of $200 billion. The amendment on the floor accelerates the insolvency of Social Security. My amendment has a negligible effect on Social Security. Let me urge everyone, let's support our cops and firefighters and teachers, but let's also not throw our seniors down the river. I urge you to vote yes.
Senator from Oregon.
The House rejected the Cruz proposal by a wide margin. Voting for this amendment, sending it back to the House right before the 118th Congress adjourns, is in effect a vote to kill the bill. I'd urge the body to reject this Hail Mary attempt to kill the bill and yield back.
Question. Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso.
Sure.
Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Booker.
No.
Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Braun. Mrs. Britt. Mr. Brown. Mr. Budd. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. I didn't get Merkley. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Daines. Ms. Duckworth. No. Mr. Durbin. Ms. Ernst. Mr. Fetterman. Mrs. Fisher. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Haggerty. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Hickenlooper. Ms. Hirono. Thank you. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Kim. Mr. King. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Lankford. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lujan. Ms. Lummis. Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey. Mr. Marshall. Mr. McConnell, Mr. Merkley. Mr. Moran. Mr. Mullen. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Ossoff. Mr. Padilla. Mr. Paul. Mr. Peters, Mr. Reed, Mr. Ricketts, Mr. Risch, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schiff, Mr. Schmidt, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith. No, I got you. Thank you. Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Vance, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Welch, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young,
On this vote, the yeas are 32, the nays are 64. The 60 vote threshold having not been achieved, the amendment is not agreed to.
Madam President,
The senior senator from Idaho.
Madam President, I call up my amendment number 3331 and ask that it be reported by number.
The clerk will report.
The senator from Idaho, Mr. Crapo, proposes an amendment number 3331.
There will now be 2 minutes for debate, equally divided.
Madam President,
And the Senate will be in order.
Madam President, throughout this entire debate, no one has denied that this bill will hasten the insolvency of the Social Security Trust Fund and cost our hardworking Social Security recipients to lose $200 billion in Social Security benefits when it does go insolvent. My amendment simply would delay the implementation of the Social Security Fairness Act until changes are made that would offset the bill's negative effects on Social Security's actuarial balance, as determined by the Social Security Board of Trustees. Let the Finance Committee fix this bill.
Madam President.
The senior senator from Oregon.
Madam President, the public should know that the senator is raising concerns about the financial impact of this bill, while he and other leaders in his party are vowing to use every budget gimmick under the sun next year to avoid paying for their tax bill. And second, we've long had a tale of two tax codes in America, where firefighters and teachers pay with every check while the wealthy can avoid taxes. But now we'd have a tale of two deficits, where deficits don't exist when it benefits the wealthy, but any changes benefiting firefighters have to be paid for. I'd urge my colleagues to vote against this amendment.
The question is on the amendment. Is there a sufficient second? There is. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Braun. Mr. Booker, no. Mrs. Britt. Aye. Mr. Brown. Mr. Budd. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins.
That's correct.
Mr. Coons. Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Daines. Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Ms. Ernst. Mr. Fetterman. Mrs. Fisher. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Haggerty. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Hickenlooper.
Here we go. My brain's not functioning.
Ms. Arono. Mr. Hoven.
I just could have crossed out all the knots.
Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kelly.
No,
Mr. Kennedy.
that's wrong.
Mr. Kim. Mr. King. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Langford. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lujan. Ms. Lummis. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Markey. Mr. Marshall. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Moran. Mr. Mullen. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Ossoff. Mr. Padilla. Mr. Paul. Mr. Peters. Mr. Reed. Mr. Ricketts. Mr. Risch. Mr. Romney. Ms. Rosen. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schiff. Mr. Schmidt. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott of Florida. Mr. Scott of South Carolina. Mrs. Shaheen. Ms. Sinema. Ms. Smith. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Chester. Mr. Thune. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Tuberville. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Vance. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warnock. Ms. Warren. Mr. Welch. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Barrasso, Blackburn, Britt, Budd, Carper, Cornyn, Kramer, Crapo, Cruz, Ernst, Graham, Grassley, Haggerty, Hoeven, Hyde-Smith, Johnson, Langford, Lee, Lummis, Marshall, McConnell, Paul, Risch, Romney, Rounds, Schmidt, Scott of Florida, Scott of South Carolina, Thune, Tillis, Tuberville, Wicker. Mr. Daines, aye. Is he on? No. Mr. Young, aye. Good. Senators voting in the negative: Baldwin, Bennett, Blumenthal, Booker, Bozeman, Braun, Brown, Cantwell, Capito, Cardin, Casey, Cassidy, Collins, Coons, Cortez Masto, Cotton, Duckworth, Durbin, Fetterman, Fisher, Gillibrand, Hassan, Hawley, Heinrich, Hickenlooper, Hirono, Kane, Kelly, Kennedy, Kim, King, Klobuchar, Lujan, Markey, Merkley, Moran, Mullen, Murkowski, Murray, Ossoff, Padilla, Peters, Reed, Ricketts, Rosen, Sanders, Schatz, Schumer, Shaheen, Smith, Stabenow, Sullivan, Tester, Van Hollen, Warner, Warnock, Warren, Welch, Whitehouse, Wyden.
Rock and roll.
Ms. Sinema, no.
Everything we believe in. They're going to come.
Mr. Murphy, no.
On this vote, the yeas are 34, the nays are 62. The 60 vote threshold having not been achieved, the amendment is not agreed to.
I don't know. The big money.
Madam President,
The senior senator from Utah.
the economist Milton Friedman once said, quote, "Keep your eye on one thing and one thing only. How much government is spending, because that is the true tax. If you're not paying for it in the form of explicit taxes, you're paying for it indirectly in the form of inflation or in the form of borrowing," close quote. The Senate is poised to enact another tax on the American people this week, tonight, in fact, a $200 billion tax that will leave a hole in the Social Security Trust Fund. This tax will give extra Social Security benefits to just 4% of the American workforce at the expense of the other 96% of hardworking Americans. We must be honest with ourselves in acknowledging that this bill is fiscally irresponsible. To make matters worse, it's entirely unnecessary at this moment in time. There's no reason why we have to be pressed to pass it tonight. Congress is up against no particular deadlines, nor is any program at risk of expiring. Social Security is already on a dangerously unsustainable path. The trust fund is projected to run out of money in the next decade, which would lead to an across-the-board benefit cut. This bill would accelerate that crisis. To tax the American people to the tune of another $200 billion is ludicrous by itself, but to do so when there is no immediate need is nefarious. To that end, Madam President, the pending measure, H.R. 82, would cause an increase of $197.81 billion in the level of Social Security deficits relative to the levels deemed for budget enforcement. Therefore, I raise a point of order against this measure under Section 311A3 of the Congressional Budget Act of 1974.
Madam President.
The junior senator from Rhode Island.
Madam President, pursuant to Section 904 of the Congressional Budget Act of 1974 and the waiver provisions of applicable budget resolutions, I move to waive all applicable sections of that act and applicable budget points of order for the purpose of the pending measure. I ask for the yeas and nays, and for the sake of our retired police officers, firefighters, and teachers, I would urge you to provide a lot more yeas than nays.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin,
Yes.
Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Booker,
Sorry. I believe in America.
Mr. Bozeman,
I believe in America.
Mr. Braun,
Help me, people. Help me.
Mrs. Britt, Mr. Brown, Mr. Budd, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn. I'm sorry. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz.
Yeah, I saw him. I'm going to let her know. Did you get Fetterman?
You're an I. Correct. Mr. Janes, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mr. Fetterman, Mrs. Fisher, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Oh, right there. Mr. Johnson, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. Kim, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Mr. Mullen, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Reed, Mr. Ricketts, Mr. Risch, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schiff, Mr. Schmidt, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Vance, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Welch, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young,
On this vote, the yeas are 66, the nays are 30. 3/5 of the senators duly chosen and sworn having voted in the affirmative. The motion is agreed to, and the point of order fails. Under the previous order, the motion to commit and all pending amendments are withdrawn. The bill is considered read a third time, and the question occurs on passage of the bill. Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
Aye.
Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Braun. Mrs. Britt. Mr. Brown. Mr. Budd. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mr. Fetterman, Mrs. Fisher, I got it. Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Ms. Arono, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. Kim, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Mr. Mullen, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Reed, Mr. Ricketts, Mr. Risch, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schiff, Mr. Schmidt, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Vance, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Welch, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young,
On this vote, the yeas are 76, the nays are 20. The 60 vote threshold having been achieved, the bill is passed.
Madam President. Madam President, can we have some order, please?
The Senate will be in order.
Can we have some order, please?
The Democratic leader.
Thank you, Madam President. So tonight, the Senate finally corrects a 50-year mistake by passing the Social Security Fairness Act. Millions of retired teachers and firefighters and letter carriers and state and local workers have waited decades for this moment. No longer will public retirees see their hard-earned Social Security benefits robbed from them thanks to this bill. It's a very good thing that one of the final acts of the 118th Congress is delivering a huge win for working Americans. I thank my colleagues on both sides of the aisle for their outstanding work, particularly Senators Brown, Collins, Cassidy, who led the way, and all those who relentlessly across the country called their senators and got this done. And then, Madam President, tonight the Senate delivers more good news for America. Tonight, the Senate delivers good news for America. There will be no government shutdown right before Christmas. This is a good bill. It'll keep the government open and funds and helps Americans affected by hurricanes and natural disasters, helps our farmers and avoid harmful cuts. We have order, please.
The Senate will be in order.
After a chaotic few days in the House, it's good news that the bipartisan approach in the end prevailed. It's a good lesson for next year. Both sides have to work together. But by dealing with people who've had trouble with disasters, by helping our farmers avoiding harmful cuts, this is a good bill, and I'm glad we're passing it. I thank my Republican colleagues for working with us to move this bill quickly through the Senate. It's a good outcome for America and the American people. I yield the floor.
Under the previous order, the Senate will proceed to the consideration of H.R. 10545, which the clerk will report.
H.R. 10545, an act making further continuing appropriations for the fiscal year ending September 30, 2025, and for other purposes.
There will now be up to 30 minutes for debate, equally divided.
Madam President.
The senior senator from Washington.
Madam President, I will not use 15 minutes, but I do want to just let our colleagues know that I am very pleased that we're on the verge of passing long overdue relief, desperately needed by communities who are recovering from disaster, as well as avoiding a damaging shutdown. The only reason it took so long and this much chaos to get here is that House Republicans chose chaos and chose to follow the whims of the richest man in the world. Needless to say, that is not how this should work, but I am glad that at the end of the day, we will avoid a shutdown and get disaster relief out to families and communities who are struggling after being hit by hurricanes and fires and floods and so much more. I worked hard with members on both sides of the aisle to finally get this aid across the line and to make sure we did so in a comprehensive way that meets the wide range of critical needs in the country. Because it is painfully clear there are so many communities who are still reeling from hurricanes and wildfires, tornadoes, flooding, and more, who really do need this support. So despite all the unnecessary chaos and delay, I am glad that we are finally here getting this done. This relief will make a critical difference for folks who've lost it all and are simply working to get their feet back underneath them. I urge all of my colleagues to join me in passing this package so we can get this over the line and avoid a needless shutdown as we head into the holidays. And finally, Madam President, one last important thing. I want to recognize my colleagues who helped pull this relief package together, especially my Vice Chair on Appropriations, Senator Collins, who's been a critical partner, our House counterparts, Congresswoman DeLauro, Congressman Cole, who have pushed so hard to get this disaster relief done. And of course, I want to thank all of our staff, especially Evan Schatz, our staff director, who worked so hard around the clock to pull together not just the disaster relief in this package, but so many other critical funding packages and proposals over the last 2 years I've been chair of the Appropriations Committee. The work is never easy, and I'm incredibly grateful to our entire team and to all of our colleagues who've been working so hard. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor.
Madam President.
The senior senator from Maine.
Madam President, I rise to urge passage of the American Relief Act. This bill will avert a costly government shutdown. Although it is after midnight, we are going to avert it. It will deliver much needed assistance to individuals, small businesses, and communities working to rebuild and repair in the wake of natural disasters. It provides much needed aid to our farmers across the country who have been hit by a tidal wave of harmful economic conditions. I want to thank the many senators who contributed to this legislation, and in particular, I want to recognize Chair Murray for her leadership of the Appropriations Committee during this Congress. I hope that in the next Congress, we can bring appropriations bills to the Senate floor in a timely fashion to avoid this kind of end of the year pileup. I do urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I too want to recognize and thank my outstanding staff for their hard work. Finally, Madam President, I do want to say that it is a great accomplishment that tonight the Senate passed the Social Security Fairness Act, which will be sent to the President for his signature. This is long overdue, and I want to share with my colleagues one really important fact, and that is that 83% of those who are affected by the government pension offset, which we repealed tonight, are lower income women. So this is a great accomplishment to eliminate these two inequitable, unfair provisions of the Social Security Act. It's going to make a big difference. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor.
Madam President,
The Democratic leader.
this is the last vote not only of this evening, but of the 118th Congress, and we yield back all time.
All time is yielded back. The clerk will read the title of the bill for the third time.
HR 10545, an act making further continuing appropriations and so forth and for other purposes.
The question is on passage of the bill. Is there a sufficient second? There is. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
Aye.
Mr. Barrasso. Yeah. Thank you. Gotcha. Mr. Bennett. I was going to say, what are you doing? Yeah. Pardon. Capitol case. You too. Merry Christmas. Merry Christmas. Thank you. Merry Christmas. You too. Thank you. Yep. Thank you. Okay, I bet you. Thank you. Right.
Absolutely. 55 minutes I was on. 55 minutes. That's pretty good.
Mr. Bozeman. Thank you.
White House eye.
Thank you.
And Merry Christmas. to
Merry
you.
Christmas. Thank you. Thank you.
I'm going to do better next year. I promise.
Merry Christmas.
It's my New Year's resolution. My New Year's resolution.
Thank you.
Really? I think I can ruin things like that. I'm New Year's resolution. Thank you, sir. You too.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Good holiday.
Merry Christmas. Thank
I
you.
will. I will. I'm doing well.
Okay. You bet. Merry Christmas. Thank you. Thank you. Merry Christmas. Thank you. I do. I got you. Thanks, Smith. For sure.
Merry Christmas.
Thank you.
Happy holidays.
Yeah.
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. You too.
I do. Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Braun, Mrs. Britt, Mr. Brown, Mr. Budd, Miss Cantwell. Oh, thank you. Mrs. Capito, Mr. Carden, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins. She's there. She's not. Okay. Thank you. Gotcha. I gotcha. Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz. Merry Christmas. Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mr. Fetterman, Mrs. Fisher. I did. Thank you. Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Ms. Hirona, Mr. Hoban, Mrs. Height-Smith, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. Kim, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Lankford, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan. Thank you. Happy Hanukkah. Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Mr. Mullen, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Reed, Mr. Ricketts, Mr. Risch, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schiff, Mr. Schmidt, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Vance, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Welch, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young.
Okay. On this vote, the yeas are 85, the nays are 11. The 60-vote threshold having been achieved, the bill is passed. Under the previous order, the Senate will resume executive session to consider the following nominations in block, calendar numbers 851, 853, 854, and 857. The question occurs on the nominations in block. All in favor say aye. Any opposed, nay? The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The nominations are confirmed on block. Under the previous order, the motion to reconsider is considered, made, and laid upon the table, and the president will be immediately notified of the Senate's actions.
Mr. President.
From Colorado.
Thank you, Mr. President. In a moment, I will ask for unanimous consent to pass H.R. 3433, the Bipartisan Give Kids a Chance Act. I'd like to highlight how important this legislation is for children with cancer all across this country. The Give Kids a Chance Act finally authorizes the FDA to direct companies who are conducting research for adult cancer drugs to study those drugs in combination with others to see whether they also can work well for kids who have cancer. The bill continues the work that Senator Rubio and I started in 2017 when we worked together to pass the Race for Children Act, which required sponsors of certain adult cancer drugs to study the benefits or the effects and their use in children. Since then, Senator Rubio and I have both learned that combination therapies can be effective treatments and reduce risk of side effects significantly, both for adults and for kids. That's why this legislation is so important. This bill could help save the lives of children all over our country who have the most aggressive forms of cancer. It would ensure that pharmaceutical companies are being held accountable to study how their drugs affect children who may have the same kind of cancer as adults, but who need.
Please
appreciate
continue.
that, Mr. President. Thank you very much. Who appreciate more tailored treatment in combination with other drugs. I know Senator Rubio and I have both heard numerous stories from patients who have asked for themselves and parents who have asked on behalf of their children and who have advocated on behalf of children who have passed away. This bill also authorizes the FDA to take enforcement action against companies that do not conduct the pediatric trials that are required under the Pediatric Research Equity Act. It requires the FDA to report on enforcement of this act. Additionally, the bill reauthorizes the FDA Rare Pediatric Disease Priority Review Voucher Program through fiscal year 2029, which incentivizes drug development for rare pediatric diseases. Mr. President, this bill has the support of dozens and dozens of organizations that represents kids and parents all across our country. I'd ask their names be included in the record. In the interest of time this evening, I won't read them on the floor, although I want to say how deeply I appreciate their efforts.
Without objection.
I'd also like to highlight the bipartisan nature of this work. Senator Rubio, as a co-sponsor, with Senator Casey and Mullins, who have co-sponsored provisions of this House bill as well. This bill has passed unanimously out of the House Energy and Commerce Committee. It has passed the House by voice vote. Mr. President, it's now the time to pass this bill. If we pass it tonight, it will go to the President for his signature. I ask unanimous consent, Mr. President, that the Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions be discharged from further consideration of, and the Senate proceed to H.R. 3433. Further, that the bill be considered read a third time and passed, and the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there objection?
Mr.
Senator
President,
from Kentucky.
I object.
Objection is heard.
Mr. President.
Senator from Colorado.
Mr. President, I just want to say how deeply I regret the objection of the senator from Kentucky. That's, of course, his right. I gather that he's objecting because he objects to the lateness of the hour and the time at when this request was made. At least that's what I was told earlier tonight. I think after we have been held here in place for hours and hours and hours, the idea that we're not going to be able to pass this legislation is deeply, deeply disappointing to the people who have advocated for this for all these years. It's a reflection, I think, of how broken this place is and the way that it puts its own interests ahead of the interests of the people that we represent. But we will be back to fight another day. Mr. President, I wish you and the staff here in the Senate at this late hour, and to my colleagues that are here as well, happy holidays and Merry Christmas, and we'll see you in the new year.
Mr. President.
The senator from New Hampshire.
Mr. President, I rise today to urge my colleagues to pass into law life-saving bipartisan legislation that will enable us to keep fighting the opioid and fentanyl epidemic that has destroyed families and devastated communities all across our country. New data from just this week found that drug overdose deaths dropped 17% from last summer to this summer. We now have a much better sense of what works to prevent and treat addiction, the resources we need to do so, and the light that exists on the other end of this terrible, terrible tunnel. But we can only get there if we keep up the fight. The SUPPORT Act of 2018 established vital addiction treatment infrastructure. Reauthorizing this law is essential to our addiction prevention, treatment, and recovery efforts. Just two of many examples include funding addiction treatment for pregnant women and supporting first responders. Now, the original SUPPORT Act passed the Senate with 98 votes, and the bipartisan reauthorization passed the House with 386 votes. Now the Senate must send it to the president's desk before we adjourn for the year. This is not time for complacency, nor is it time for despair. Nothing less than people's lives depend on us acting. So, Mr. President, as if in legislative session, I ask unanimous consent that the Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions be discharged from further consideration of H.R. 4531, and the Senate proceed to its immediate consideration. Further, that the bill be considered read a third time and passed, and the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there objection?
Mr. President,
Senator from Kentucky.
I object.
The objection is heard.
And Mr. President,
Senator from New Hampshire.
I will just say that I regret the objection. This was a Senate version of the reauthorization was, of course, included in the package that we all agreed on, bipartisan agreement in both the Senate and the House after months and months of work, reauthorized through our committee process and was stripped out, of course, on Wednesday at the instruction of Mr. Musk. So the House had already passed this bipartisan bill. It had a huge and overwhelming bipartisan support there. And this is really unfortunate because, of course, the opioid epidemic, especially the fentanyl epidemic, continues to devastate our communities. And it is truly unfortunate that the objection was made tonight. Thank you, Mr. President.
Colorado.
I suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
Mr. President.
Majority Leader.
So, Mr. President, the
We're in a
work,
quorum call.
ask unanimous consent, the quorum be dispensed with.
Without objection.
So, Mr. President, the work of the 118th Congress comes to an end. The majority in this chamber will soon change hands. Tonight, I'd like to take a moment to thank my colleagues for their outstanding work over the past 4 years. This was the most productive, ambitious, and historic 4 years the Senate has seen in decades. I am proud that many of our biggest accomplishments were bipartisan, something I hope the incoming majority embraces as a model. And the accomplishments speak for themselves. They're enormous. I was so proud to lead the Senate when we did so much for so many people, and as I said, so much of it bipartisan. It started at the beginning in 2017 when COVID, and 2020 when COVID was at its worst. We passed the American Rescue Plan, sending checks to every mailbox and shots in every arm. It helped reduce the problems with COVID so quickly, more quickly than people ever felt. We passed a once-in-a-generation bipartisan infrastructure law. You see the effects of it all over America right now. Infrastructure is being rebuilt. People are being employed. Our country is getting more efficient, which it always does when we have better infrastructure. And it rebuilt Americans' roads and bridges and highways. It provided kids with safe drinking water. Rural communities, urban communities got access to broadband, which they had never had before, so essential in the 21st century. We brought manufacturing jobs back to our shores and revitalized American innovation through the CHIPS and Science Act. We took on the NRA and won by passing the first gun safety law in 30 years. We passed the greatest expansion of veterans care in a generation to ensure that no veteran is denied treatment related to toxic exposure in burn pits. This, and on almost every one of these issues, it was the Senate that led the way. Bipartisan, senators got together with one another and passed legislation that then the House followed and the president signed. But make no mistake about it, we were the cauldron. We were the place where it all got put together and melded together. And I'm proud of the job, frankly, that I did as majority leader, but I'm so proud of our senators on both sides of the aisle who got so much done. And there were other things we did as well. We stood with our friends in Ukraine as they defend their country against the brutality of Vladimir Putin. We took a stand to protect marriage equality. Through the Inflation Reduction Act, we made insulin $35 a month for millions of seniors. We empowered Medicare to negotiate with drug companies for the first time. The IRA was also the most ambitious clean energy bill in American history. The effects are happening all over the country. Our kids are going to breathe cleaner air. Our community will see less pollution. And future generations are going to see millions of new good-paying jobs as we complete the wind and solar and nuclear and all the other parts of the bill. That made us so proud of what we were able to do. It was incredible. The list goes on and on. And our legacy in these past 4 years, when we were in the majority, is just large. It's grand. I'm proud of it. We also, let's not forget, confirmed 235 highly qualified and historic judges to the bench, more than a quarter of all active judges. We're so proud of this ambitious record. Years from now, when Americans drive on better roads, buy cleaner cars, make faster chips, have better paying jobs, save on prescription drugs, it'll be the work of this majority. In conclusion, I want to thank the staff here in the Senate who work behind the scenes and make this chamber come to light. The incredible floor staff sitting here who do incredible work. Thank you to the miracle workers of the cloakroom. They always find everybody wherever they are. You say someone's missing, and there they are. Thank you to the Senate doorkeepers, to the Secretary of the Senate, and the Senate Sergeant at Arms, to the pages and support staff, and to all of those who make this place function. And a special thanks to my staff. What an amazing, hardworking, dedicated, smart, compassionate, caring group of people they are. I know this for sure. Without my staff, none of this would have been accomplished. They keep me going. Sometimes when I veer off course, they get me back on course. Sometimes when I'm doing too much, they sort of limit me. Oftentimes, when I want to do something that's a yes, they sometimes say no. But all too often, they find the better way to do yes. So they're great. I love them. And I'm grateful to them as well. So there'll be much to do in the year to come. The work will continue. The challenges will be great. And we will no longer be in the majority, we'll be in the minority. But our North Star will not change, working every single day to serve the American people and reward the trust they have placed in us. I yield the floor. And absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
Mr. President.
The Majority Leader.
Mr. President, are we in a quorum?
We are.
I ask unanimous consent the quorum be dispensed with.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to executive session and the Senate Foreign Relations Committee be discharged from further consideration of PN 794, 795, 796, accepting Peter Gauthier, Mark Gray, Stephen Renecki, Lori DeTroy. 898, accepting Kenneth McLean, Amanda Van Den Duel, and Adriana Harvey. 1535, 1536, 1538, 1539, accepting Sean Jones, Carl Fickenscher. 1540, accepting Kenneth McLean. 1975, 2031, 2146, 2148, 2233, 2234, 2235, 2004, 1537, accepting Janie P. Pierre Louis, 1978, 2147. That the Senate proceed to their en bloc consideration and vote without intervening action or debate. That if confirmed, the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate, and the President be immediately notified of the Senate's actions and the Senate resume legislative session.
Is there objection? Question occurs on the nominations in block. All in favor say aye. Any opposed, nay?
Aye.
Any opposed, nay? The ayes appears to have it. The ayes do have it. The nominations are confirmed en bloc.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the appointments at the desk appear separately in the record as if made by the chair.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the junior senator from Virginia, the senior senator from Ohio, and the senior senator from Maryland be authorized to duly sign duly enrolled bills or joint resolutions from December 20th, 2024 through January 3rd, 2025.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that notwithstanding the upcoming adjournment of the Senate, the President of the Senate, the President pro tem, and the majority and minority leaders be authorized to make appointments to commissions, committees, boards, conferences, or interparliamentary conferences authorized by law, by concurrent action of the two houses, or by order of the Senate.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of Calendar 648, H.R. 4984.
The clerk will report.
Calendar number 648, H.R. 4984, an act to direct the Secretary of the Interior to transfer administrative jurisdiction over the Robert F. Kennedy Memorial Stadium campus to the District of Columbia, and so forth and for other purposes.
Is there objection proceeding to the measure? Without objection, the Senate will proceed to the measure.
I ask unanimous consent the bill be considered read a third time.
Without objection,
I know of no further debate on the bill.
is there further debate? If not, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, no. The ayes appears to have it. The ayes do have it.
I ask unanimous.
The bill is passed.
I ask the unanimous consent the motions to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of Calendar 685 S5